afternoon and welcome to the Delaware Public Service Commission meeting of July 10th, 2018. We have the reading of the meeting minutes of June 29th, 2018. Does anyone have any corrections or changes to the meeting minutes?
Yes, I do. Executive Director Barua was not in attendance at that meeting, is my understanding, so.
Yes.
Serves, and it says that he was, so.
Second paragraph.
I think Donna knows where it is. Are there any more changes? May we have a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
Motion to approve the minutes as
I
amended.
second it.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. We've got the consent agenda with one item on it. Any commissioner wish that to come off the consent agenda?
Move we adopt the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Regular agenda. In the matter of the petition of the Public Service Commission staff and Delaware Division of the Public Advocate to establish a regulation for distribution system investment plans for Delaware Electric, natural gas, and water utilities. We're going to be considering a joint petition, and I welcome all the parties and all those water companies that apparently are interested very much in this as well to come to the table. And gosh, it's a joint petition, so why don't we call on the DPA to lead this one rather than call on the state?
With the commission's consideration, I'm going to throw this one to Mr. Slater, as he was the one who was involved in all of the legislative activity, and I was not. So I would not want to get anything wrong, and therefore, plus he really wanted to do this one.
Mr. Slater, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Like Ms. Iori said, I was intimately involved in distribution planning, and I'm going to try not to bore you with all the back details, but this has to do with the DSIC legislation that was in the General Assembly for Delmarva and Chesapeake. There was actually an agreement between Delmarva, Chesapeake staff, and the DPA to look at distribution planning through the regulatory process instead of looking at it through the legislative process, which initially I had a draft amendment to do so. So I'm going to try and go through this pretty quickly. So I'll start off by saying what's distribution planning, what it's for. This was my letter to the Speaker of the House, and it kind of gives a good background on how we got here. So on April 18th of 2017, I wrote a letter to the General Assembly highlighting my opposition to Senate Bill 80. You okay?
Senate Bill
80. While I opposed this legislation at the time, the Industrial Coalition was able to add a substantial amendment that provided significant protection, namely Senate Amendment 1, which added a sunset provision of 7 years. And then on April 24th of 2018, a year later, Delmarva Power, the Public Service Commission staff, and my office came to an agreement to effect distribution planning through regulation. As we know, regulations can at times take several years to promulgate, and so therefore my office asked that a timeline be included. That timeline provides the proposals for review and approval to the Commission by September 1st of 2019, with the first meeting taking place by July 31st of 2018, and an update to our process by March 31st of 2019. On May 1st of 2018, Chesapeake Utilities by email committed to, and I quote, participate in the meetings between Delmarva Power, Commission staff, and the Public Advocate in a good faith effort to bring to the Commission some form of distribution planning for Chesapeake that will be tied to DSIC applications. Distribution planning provides consumer protection so they know what's being spent before it's actually spent. As one of only a few states without a prudence measure, we have business judgment rule, it is extremely difficult to prove a business didn't use its business judgment with respect to capital expenditures. Distribution planning will neutralize the reactive nature of the distribution system improvement charge and allow for a proactive approach to spending by allowing for review of a long-term plan. I believe many concerns have arisen because of the ambiguous nature of our agreement. Those were the concerns raised by the legislature. So to be clear, what I was asking for is that distribution planning should include 5 things: consideration of non-wire alternatives, least cost alternatives, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and importantly, a cost-benefit analysis. An article from Utility Dive, dated July 12th of 2017, discussed non-wire alternatives, stating, and I quote, "Traditionally, when a transmission or distribution system operator had a need to upgrade or replace infrastructure due to aging equipment or increased load demand, it would simply conduct poles and wires projects on which it could earn a regulated rate of return. No thought was given to alternatives in addressing the issue. It was simply seen as replacing a part in the electric grid machine. Further, more creative solutions are being explored to address infrastructure needs at a lower cost with higher customer and environmental benefits as grid management and distribution energy resource technology has improved." To be clear, I'm not suggesting that any utility doesn't consider these options, but what I am suggesting is that we and all consumers don't know that. And that's why distribution planning is important. So we agreed to look at this in a good faith effort. Distribution planning traditionally has been the focus of safety, reliability, and at a reasonable cost. This was according to Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium, which is part of, funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. The consortium is the 14 national laboratories. And so, while that was Delmarva and Chesapeake, we really came down and said, this really needs to be all utilities. Because as Delmarva and Chesapeake argued in the legislature, we want what the water utility has. Well, in this case, I think what Delmarva and Chesapeake had agreed to is fair for the water utilities. And when you talk about safety, reliability, and at a reasonable cost, considering other new technologies, that encompasses everyone. It shouldn't just be one utility versus another. How we came about looking at the water utilities, Senator Simpson had actually called me to testify. And when he called me, he said, why did you previously oppose this? And so I explained why I previously opposed it in Senate Amendment 1, and then the important factor was distribution planning. And he said that he was opposed to this in 2001 for the water utilities, and he was very leery of this. As a funny side note, my grandfather was actually a sponsor of that bill, so it's kind of funny that I'm here now. So he was opposed to it and didn't think that it was necessary. And so I talked about distribution planning. He was really pretty excited. And actually, everyone I have talked to said this is a really reasonable request, whether it's the large industry users or staff or us or anyone else, that this is not asking for anything that you shouldn't already be doing. It's just saying, hey, we should be able to see it. So he asked a very poignant question and said, will you do this for water utilities? And my answer was yes, and that's how we got here today, is that it should be all utilities. Senator Simpson had made that request. I commented back yes, and so that is how we are here. I think it should be equitable and include the water utilities as well. A DSIC by nature is a reactive mechanism. You say you're going to spend X amount of money, you spend it, and then you tell us what you spend it on. Distribution planning is a proactive measure to say, hey, we should know what you're spending before you're spending it, but also we should know that you're looking at other considerations as well. And again, I'm not saying that the utilities don't do that. We just don't know, and none of us know that. The NAWC said that there's 2.8 million miles of pipe that are in need of repair or replacement. It's estimated to cost $1 trillion over the next 20 years to replace this aging infrastructure. I believe that the utilities know this and have infrastructure that may need to be replaced. But the part of the DSIC argument was to replace aging infrastructure in a more timely fashion, enhance service quality, and reduction of water loss through leaks. That's according to National Association of Water Companies, of which Tidewater, Artesian, and Suez are all members. So I'm sure this is going to be a lively conversation, and I think I'll leave it at that. But think I'll just stop there for now. If possible, I'd like to reserve some time for any other comments.
Yes, sir. Mr. Walsh?
Thank you, Chairman, Commissioners. This is a joint petition, of course, and staff supports presentation and the facts set forth by Mr. Slater, and will not be redundant in repeating any of those. So I will just note our support in full for all that has been presented thus far.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Gosh, we appear to have some other people interested. Mr. Goodman, why don't we go with you first?
Thank you, Your Honor, and we tried to be a little bit organized and agreed that I would, amongst us friendly utilities, that I would go first, because I think that we were the ones primarily who had reached the agreement with staff and EPA, and then Mr. O'Brien and his utilities thought it was a good thing and signed on. So I want to be very clear. I hope this won't be a question about this, is Delmarva absolutely does not object to opening a docket for exploring a proposal and even eventual rules for distribution planning for electric and gas. But we are very disturbed at how this petition was done, how it came about, and that it does not reflect at all what is a clear written agreement with the DPA and staff. We find it, quite frankly, troubling that this petition was filed without providing any notice at all to Delmarva Power or any other utility. We learned about it by chance on Friday when one of our employees sent an email to staff saying, hey, pursuant to our agreement, we're supposed to have a meeting by July 31st. How about these couple of dates? And this is Friday afternoon now. And we got our response back, oh, it's going to be on the agenda. You know, we'll talk after Tuesday. And so this person told me, and I went and opened the agenda, and wow, a joint petition. I hadn't heard anything about this. But there was nothing to click on to open the document. So I went on to Delafile, and the only thing on there was just the petition itself. I thought it was only a portion of the petition because it just ends. There's no signature. There's nothing. None of the attached documents. It wasn't until Monday that I could get the rest of it yesterday, which I found to be, I don't think that is the appropriate way to treat anyone. Certainly not, and I can't imagine that this commission thinks it's appropriate to do that to all the utilities that it regulates. Day before, here comes a major petition that we just happened to find out about. You can't argue, no one can argue that was appropriate, and it's simply not. The petition itself is not even in compliance with the very bare minimums of your rules of practice and procedure. For instance, Rule 1.7.2, and I'm quoting now, says that all petitions and other filings that allege facts not otherwise in the record must be accompanied by a signed and sworn verification. This isn't even signed. It doesn't say who filed it. There's not even a name associated with it. That's just the beginning. Now, as I stated, we do not object to opening a docket, but we do object to the rules that are attached. The rules that are attached, I don't know if you've had a chance to review them, and I apologize for only handing out what I'm going to hand up now, because that's what happens when you don't find out about something until less than 24 hours before you have to be here to argue. So with your permission, I just have a couple documents I'd like to refer to, if I may approach.
Yes, sir.
These were literally put together this morning as I was trying to figure out what to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. that says, you got to sign these things and have a verification. Why? Because, you got to verify that the facts are true and correct. As I said before, when the only thing I was able to pull off a Della file late Friday afternoon was just the petition, it looked like it wasn't the whole petition, because it just kind of ended, wasn't even a signature block or anything, and none of the attachments were there. If you'll turn to the second document, you'll see this letter agreement that was signed by Delmarva Power. You see our president, Gary Stockbridge's name, Mr. Slater, the DPA himself, and I think Mr. Hardigan. Very creative signature there, Mr. Hardigan. Anyway, it's very clear about what we agreed to. And the first sentence, the three parties, quote, "agree to work together to develop a proposal to submit to the commission concerning enhanced distribution planning." Key words, agree to work together. Then it says DPA, Delmarva, and staff will work in good faith to provide recommendations to submit any proposals for review and approval to the commission by September 1st, 2019. So we get this surprise filing, and what is it? It attaches less than 3/4 of a page of rules for all the electric distribution planning, and then has about 3/4 of a page for gas, same for water. That is not working together or collaborating in good faith with Delmarva Power to come up with a recommendation on what to do for distribution planning. That is not close to what was agreed to in that letter. And probably why that letter wasn't read by the DPA, probably why I read the advocacy letter, because our agreement is clear. Chesapeake was shown that letter. They clearly agreed to abide by it as well. And then we come up with these draft rules. And if you look at them, you'll see there's a whole lot of problems with them. First of all, you're not going to do distribution planning in less than 1 page of rules. Second of all, the rules are just wildly inconsistent. For example, proposed rule 2.1 requires annual distribution planning reports, but then you go a few lines down to 2.1.2 and it requires distribution planning every 3 years. I don't think you want to publish something with that blatant of an error in it. They're very vague. You look at rule number 2.1.2.5. It requires, and I'm quoting, a cost-benefit analysis using a measurement metric approved by the commission. But the rules don't say what that metric is or what's been approved by the commission. I mean, you're going to publish rules like that? The rules, as proposed rules, violate established statutes. For instance, Rule 2.1.2.7 requires Delmarva to consider, and I quote, energy efficiency initiatives in place of new plant and equipment. But very well-known state law says that only the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council can make recommendations for approving energy efficiency initiatives. The rules are unworkable and overbearing. Rule 2.1.2.11 requires, and I quote, detailed engineering and technical design of all proposed projects in the distribution plan. Delmarva Electric Division alone conducts well in excess of 150 to 200 individual projects a year. Then you add gas to that, probably another 50, so that's 200 to 250. I don't know what the commission or staff would do with detailed engineering drawings for over 250 projects a year. I don't think you want that, and I don't think you want to deal with the cost of having us produce that. But that's what these rules say. Then you add all the water companies. What are we in now? 5, 6, 700 thousands? I don't even know. But these rules are just, they're wild. Yet the petition asks you to publish those rules, spend thousands of dollars filing public notices in the newspapers, and it does cost thousands. I think the last time we noticed hearings, the bill was about $6,500 just for one day. And then to have all the public come in and comment on them, on rules that clearly aren't going to resemble anything like what the rules would be. That is just a waste of time and money. I ask you to turn back to the agreement. It says that We will work together in good faith to provide recommendations, and to submit any proposals for review and approval to the commission by September 1st, 2019.
Mr. Goodman? Have you
Yes.
talked to Mr. Stockbridge about your comments regarding this agreement?
Absolutely, at length.
And he's consistent?
Not what we agreed to. What we agreed to was to
Okay,
get
first of
together-
all, let me just make a comment.
Sure.
I'm not gonna participate in this part of the discussion, because I was there. I talked with Mr. Stockbridge, I talked with Mr. Slater, and in my humble opinion, you know, there were modifications to any written agreement, quite candidly, much after April 24th. In other words, there were discussions, there was discussions in a Democratic caucus about what was going to happen, and clearly, rules and regulations were contemplated by those discussions. And
I agree 100%.
okay, well, that's not what I seem to be hearing
right,
from
well,
you,
let me-
so I'm a little concerned about
Okay,
that,
let me
because
clarify.
please don't say that everything about the agreement is contained within the four corners of this document, because it's not,
No.
in my opinion.
What I am saying is this. We absolutely agree to opening a docket. That's fine. But what we said we would do is we would work together to propose something for the commission. And that will very likely be rules. In fact, I told you last week, Heather Hall of our office reached out to schedule that. We are bringing to that initial meeting, that has to happen by July 31st, the folks who put together the distribution planning rules for other jurisdictions, people from each jurisdiction, which you see we agreed to do in this. We're very serious about this. But what we don't think is appropriate is to put, I mean, if you looked at those rules, they clearly are not close to what could eventually be agreed upon. And we think that is quite a waste to go through that process and incur those expenses. We look forward to, and we've been pushing forward with, we're trying to schedule that meeting and that process. So that's why I started out by saying, we are in great support of opening this docket. We just don't appreciate getting the surprise. You know, when we agreed that we would get together, meet, discuss how to move forward, and agree to a process, and agree to what to submit to this commission. We are very much in support of it. We've done it in our other jurisdictions, and we led that process in our other jurisdictions. So I don't want you to think that we don't want to put together rules. We just would like a little bit of notice, and we'd like them to follow the process, that we would work together and come up with something. Because that's what we've been doing. And to get something like this one day before the meeting is just not appropriate. They could have easily reached out to us and said, hey, how do you want to move forward? You want to open a docket? Yeah. And when we're putting together this meeting, we talked about it. But to see something like this, it's just not good policy. It's not good to proceed. Now, with the water companies, they shouldn't be in our docket. I mean, they'll speak for themselves. But, you know, this is not their docket. This is not their agreement. We're going forward under our agreement, which is attached to this. And that's what we want to do. So our request would be for this commission to open the docket. That's absolutely fine. We don't think that you should be incurring the cost of putting together this 3/4 of a page of rules that have nothing to do with the rules that we would eventually be putting before the public. And we also just ask that, you know, comply with the terms of this. We are looking forward to getting together and putting together rules, but not in this fashion. It is that we are supposed to work together in good faith. I've attached an order that says exactly what we believe should happen, exactly how we believe it should happen. Is that, again, I had to draft it this morning because I just got this stuff yesterday. There's a clean order and there is a divider sheet that shows the changes, but you will see that it just asks that we go forward and do exactly what everyone agreed to. It is our goal to do rules, Your Honor, and they're going to be extensive and clear rules about what happens. I know that Chesapeake agrees with this order. They told me that this morning, and so they support it as well. In the alternative, if you need some time to consider it or to look at the orders, or maybe actually direct the parties to get together and do exactly what they agreed, which is to work together, I don't see why we can't come up with an order. There's no rush on this. This is a process that's going to take some time.
Thank you, Mr. Goodman. Mr. Riley? Let's hear from Chesapeake.
Thank you, Chair Winslow and Commissioners. Bill O'Brien, Associate General Counsel for Chesapeake Utilities Corporation. Yes, we do support the modified order that Delmarva put together, which simply states the two agreements and opens the docket. We think we can move forward from there. Frankly, when we saw the agreement and we made our own commitment, we envisioned recommendations being submitted pursuant to that agreement, and at that point, we would open a rulemaking docket under the APA procedures. But certainly, we're not going to object to a docket being opened now, just to kickstart this process. But certainly, we do agree that everything should be left on the table at this point, which we think this modified order does by simply opening the docket and ordering the first meeting by July 31st, as well as the other deadlines that were put into the agreement with Delmarva. So that's where Chesapeake stands.
Thank you.
May it please the Commission, Carl Randall, General Counsel of Artesian Water Company. Present with me today is David Spaked. He's our Chief Financial Officer, and Mr. Spaked will make Artesian's primary comments.
Thank you for allowing us to speak this morning on the matter. I'll apologize in advance for taking your time to point out what I believe to be obvious in this matter. I was somewhat mystified when I saw the order and the proposed form and the joint filing. I did not have the benefit of all the background on this. This rose out of a legislative process that included solely the electric and gas companies. Water companies did not participate. We may have been mentioned, but that was about it. We did not participate at all. And I was going to end with this paragraph, but I would like to begin with it. The important part of this legislation under paragraph 315 is specific to electric, natural gas, utility distribution system improvement charges. Water utility distribution system improvement charges found in paragraph 314 and has separate administrative regulations associated with that, and I'll get to that in a moment. In the end, under, and I have to follow this through too many numbering paragraphs here. No, it would be under 4, 5D, 7, I don't know, it's under D. I'm going to read it. Sorry, I can't follow through with all the nomenclature. The commission may adopt rules and regulation not inconsistent with this title, and it's under 315, that the commission find reasonable or necessary to administer a DSIC in the event an electric and or natural gas utility applies for a DSIC before DSIC regulations specific to the particular utility are in place, then existing water DSIC regulations shall be applied to implement the utility's DSIC without delay. That paragraph was meant to suggest that if you don't have the rulemaking in place, then there is regulations that the water utilities follow that give a framework for you to follow in terms of implementing the DSIC for other. And that is how, the file, what the sorts of assets are, et cetera, although they are markedly different between electric, gas, and water utilities. So I start with suggesting that, number one, the intent of the legislature, from our view, is to implement regulations associated with that legislation, not to bootstrap in what the water utilities had and have regulations for some time ago. So in the opening joint motion by both staff and the DPA, I just want to go through a few of these things just so we're clear on why we believe that. Number one is everything in the joint motion, with the except of the gratuitous paragraph at the front talking about water utilities, speaks to the electric and gas legislation. And that's right. That's what this is supposed to do. This is supposed to implement that intent. So the threshold question was why was this proposed order brought here today? And number one, it was to implement that legislative action, and that's right. The components of relief here requested are investment that's necessary to provide safe and adequate service, which is the business judgment rule, which Mr. Slater pointed out to you earlier, And we've used that obviously on the water side as well, to looking at what investments are made for both supply and infrastructure necessary to deliver safe and adequate service. And then performance targets, which is curiously enough directly attributable to reliability of service and certain parameters that this commission instituted for electric utilities in their docket under docket PSC regulation docket 50, which has to do with reliability service. And the utilities, the electric utilities, are required to file certain planning documents to show that they will maintain reliable service down the road. And you, the commission, have set those targets for those utilities. None of those reliability targets have been established for water utilities. And in fact, because of the type of service that we provide, the ingestible nature, and the other requirements that we are under, including water quality standards, those sorts of targets would differ substantially from the targets established for electric companies with a grid system and inter and intra-LATA systems. What's critical, what I believe is critical here is paragraph 6 of the joint application here, which says on April 19th, 2018, amendment was filed to Senate Bill 80, which included several customer protections. And I think Mr. Slater alluded to these, which were a stay-out provision, public notice, and a sunset provision, all of which are specific to the electric and gas regulation or legislation that was recently passed. Key stakeholders discussed whether to include a distribution planning component in the legislation, but ultimately agreed that such information might be obtained via a commission regulation. There's the part of the intent that we point to specifically. And Commissioner Chair Dallas Winslow pointed out you were part of that process that spoke specifically to legislation on electric and gas and those sorts of parameters that you would need to look at as it pertained to their DSIC legislation. And that would be done in this sort of proceeding, and that's what the two companies here are requesting that you do. DP&L and, Delmarva Power and Chesapeake Utilities want to move forward in that. We have had no part in that legislation, no part in those discussions, no part in any sort of the parameters that are being listed in this or in the proposed regulations that are proposed to be published. In addition to that, if you look at where the proposed regulations are to be published, they are under Section 3000 of your administrative code. And if you go to your legislative code, that code is specific to electric legislation, electric regulations. Water regulations are listed under 2000. You would also note that under 2000, we have specific administrative regulations as it regards the implementation and approval of DSIC filings. And those were adopted during regulation docket number 63. And I've been around the commission for a long time, and I was always under the impression that when we wanted to change regulations previously approved, adjudicated, and adopted by the commission, that we would reopen those regulation dockets and have everybody revisit the parameters and the situation and the circumstances that gave rise to those regulations. I think in this case, the administration of their legislation should be filed with legislative intent, that you do the things that they promised to do during their legislative transaction and discussions. They've agreed to them. I think there ought to be a process open for them, as it was for us during our DSIC legislation and the ultimate administration process that took place in 2012. It did take some time, but we did have that regulation docket in 2012. For those reasons, I believe that at this time, the water utilities as a whole do not have a part in this regulation docket. We believe we have regulations that are appropriate and in place and have been adjudicated through a rather lengthy process with all parties involved participating. We did not participate in this legislation, and respectively, we hope that you would take water utilities out of this proposal and move forward as these two utilities have suggested. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Slater.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. Ms. Aori is going to hand you a document, and I'll go ahead and explain it as she's doing that. This is from Delafile when this was filed. This was filed on July 2nd, full 8 days ago. It's been on Delafile for those full 8 days. In addition, there was a phone call on last Tuesday where we specifically said to Delmarva's outside counsel that this was coming in 1 week. They've had the notice. It is not our fault that they did not look at the agenda to get this. It's been on Delafile. I understand Delafile sometimes has issues, but that is not our fault. That is very clear. It's been on there for 8 days. We've had it. They've had it since July 3rd. But if you will indulge me for just a second, I need to go back to some of the comments that were made. So this proposed form of order opens the petition. And it was mentioned that they're disturbed how this was done, and I just hopefully tried to alleviate some of that. We do agree to work together. These rules, I actually give staff a lot of credit. These rules are a starting point for a dialogue. We tried this with the gas, the staff had asked in the last rate case to do a gas distribution plan. We participated in those meetings, but unfortunately, what we got out of it was lead pipe replacement and what it was going to cost, and I think it needs to be a little more in depth than that. And so I actually appreciate the fact that staff did this and took this very proactive measure to say, look, these can all change, but we need a starting point. And especially since there was another comment to say there's no rush. There is a rush. July 31st is right around the corner. It's 3 weeks from today. So, I'm dismayed by some of the comments here. Chair, as you alluded to, this was a pretty significant compromise. And quite honestly, this is why it passed the Senate unanimously, because of my commitment to include water utilities, which was specific to what Senator Simpson had suggested. I have to take great umbrage with what Artesian has presented, because they did weigh in on the legislation. In fact, they sent a letter to the General Assembly about how wonderful the DSIC is. So I do believe that they weighed in, and I have other ways to show that they have actually weighed in. So I think it's a little disingenuous to say, keep us out. I mean, we can go into, the House caucus was very specific, and it went a lot further than this agreement. In fact, the letter that I read, and the reason I read it, was because it goes into more detail. And that was actually the problem in the House of Representatives. This bill wasn't going anywhere in the House of Representatives until I had to clarify what my position was and clarify what it was that I wanted. And part of the problem is that the agreement was I think 3 sentences long, and it left a lot of ambiguity. That was the problem. That was the reason that I wrote the letter. So, there was an intent here to add the water utilities. It started in the Senate. It proceeded through into the House. I guess I just have to go to, if you don't want to be included, what are you afraid of? If you don't have a plan already, that looks 3 to 5 years out, then we should have a full review by the commission, because all we're asking for is to make your plan available and to show safety and reliability. I mean, we can go into, safety concerns or, and other issues, but you have to have a plan, and all we're asking for is that plan be made available. In the past several months, we've seen significant water issues, not related actually to Artesian, thankfully, but we've seen issues in Millsboro and Blades, and we've seen issues just last week with Suez, which I think we're going to get into a little later. I'm not suggesting that there's malfeasance by a company. I'm not suggesting they don't already do it. I'm just suggesting that we be made available, or it be made available to us so that we can review it. And all this order does is it opens the docket, and I believe water utilities need to be included in that. We talked about the gas plan. American Water is the largest publicly traded water and wastewater utility in the United States. Exelon is the largest electric utility in the United States. There's 16 states that do some sort of distribution planning. American Water does it in California, Hawaii, New York, Illinois, Indiana, Maryland, Michigan, Pennsylvania. In total, California, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New York, Washington, D.C., Florida, Illinois, Indiana, Maryland, Michigan, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Washington all have some form of distribution planning. That is what we're asking for here, and I'm just kind of dismayed by these comments because there was the opportunity to put this in legislation, and they're kind of making me rethink that maybe that was the best way to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Dallas?
Everybody doesn't know, I was intimately involved, and I actually sat next to Mr. Slater, and both of us testified before the Democratic House caucus with respect to some of the issues we're discussing here, so I feel it's inappropriate for me to sit here as the chair and further involve myself in this discussion. So I'm going to recuse myself, and I'm going to have Joanne Conaway, Commissioner Conaway, be the chair for this particular item on the agenda.
Do any of the commissioners have questions? I see some here.
Yes, Madam Chair. Okay, so the way first of all, let me make this statement. I'm probably on this commission a student of proper preparation prevents piss poor performance. I used to call it the 6P principle. So planning is something I do believe is important, but there's some elements and aspects of planning by definition that I just want to get some clarity around. Can someone help me define integrated resource planning versus distribution planning? The distinction between them, are they related to each other? Is one a subset of the other? Are we going to be requiring more planning that is going to cost the ratepayer more money? How is that related?
We do the integrated resource planning, Your Honor, so I can explain that. There's, I think you are a Delmarva customer, and you see the bill, there's a delivery portion and a supply portion.
Yeah.
So the supply is the electrons, right? And you can get that through the SOS, or you can get it through competitive suppliers. The integrated resource planning, or IRP, is just about how we get that electricity supply. Nothing to do with the distribution. The distribution is the system that delivers it. So integrated resource planning, we've been doing that since 2007. And the only changes that have occurred in the manner in which we get the electricity are some adjustments that we do. Annually, we come into the commission and it's presented to you, and you have always approved them. Distribution system planning, which we are in great support of, is how are we going to now plan going forward? And Mr. Slater's correct. We do this extensively. We have long plans on what has to be done, what has to be replaced. And they want in on that, and we're fine with it. In fact, he listed American Water Resources doing it in 16 states. I can tell you that the Exxon utilities themselves do it. We do it in Chicago, or Illinois, sorry. Pennsylvania has extensive public distribution planning. New Jersey has it, and we want it in Delaware. We think it's good. Our problem is just the way this is starting out and going forward. We support it, and that's the difference. System versus supply. So supply is IRP, distribution, service planning is the system.
So it's additive, if you will.
Yes.
To get a
it's
complete landscape picture on planning, yes?
correct. It's
It's
the
not
physical
redundant.
plan. The planning of the physical plant and equipment
Okay.
is the distribution system plan.
Is there anyone objecting to that definition before I move on?
Mr. Goodman's recitation is correct.
Okay. So as I'm looking at this and listening to the testimony that's coming before the commission, what becomes apparent to me is, and I think I've got this order 9242 on item 3, page 3. I think I gather there's an issue with publishing regulations now if you're going to convene to, in item 4, for example, establish final distribution planning regulations later.
That is our issue, Your Honor. You're 100% correct.
That is one issue that seems apparent to me. So I would raise the question to Mr. Slater, what, in your view, is the issue with removing the publication now of regulations that will come together by consensus?
Thank you. So my comment on the regulations was merely that I appreciate the fact that we have a starting point. So, if you chose not to publish them, we can still use them as a template moving forward. That's the baseline for these regulations, is that it's a template moving forward to have meaningful dialogue so that we start off, because, we have a kind of short time frame here, that we start off and get the ball rolling immediately on July 31st.
But I think that you could bring that into the consensus forum that you're meeting before the 31st of July to start with. They don't literally have to publish before you have your first meeting, or within a week or so, a month after your first meeting. If you're asking until September of 2019 before you finish the process, there's a range of time in which something that you have developed by consensus could then be published.
Yes, I believe that you will have final regulations by September 1st of 2019.
Okay. So let me ask Mr. Spate one question with respect to the perspective from the water companies. Is it your opinion that there are no best practices employed by the water companies that could be shared in this developing consensus amongst gas and utility companies? Are there no best practices that could be shared from the water companies if you were to participate in this process?
It's not fair to say that there are no best practices. Of course there are. And we utilize those on our replacement projects to the best of our ability. Mains break, and if we have to replace them in a given year and it's not part of our plan, we switch some in and switch some out. The problem is it's a different sort of planning, and there are different pieces involved with DSIC applications, including if there's changes in water quality. We're permitted to recover under this if we have to put new treatment processes in place for new contaminants and things of that nature. We also have state highway relocations that force us to move mains ad hoc, and we try to plan for those. The state does those highway relocations as it sees fits. Those are huge dollars that are then forecasted for something that may or may not happen. Reallocate those to replacing infrastructure then that we know has to be replaced. The asbestos cement piping, cast iron, et cetera. All those pieces of pipe that we are told we need to replace because of water quality issue and the aging of that infrastructure. So we're trying to put in and put out different pieces that may not be within our 3-year budget, but then it's a matter of what the process is and how that process is afforded light under the DSIC regulations. We passed regulations in 2012 specific to water utilities for the specific criteria and instances in which it needed to ask for recovery of certain expenses. They are very different than involved with the electric and gas utilities. Very different. It's all about water quality and making sure that good water quality is delivered to its customers. That was different than the electric. They have their own reliability standard. They wanted to go a different way on the DSIC. This has always been maintained separately. We argued that a long time. We were asked about how our DSIC process works. Works fine. That's all we've had to say. And Mr. Slater said, that's what we said. It works fine for us. We have regulations. We went through an entire docket with staff, DPA at the time, and adjudicated all these issues. Now we're taking another strike at something that doesn't even really traditionally relate to water utilities. And that's a planning process that's very different the way the legislature talked about it. And these processes that they already participate in, and you have already ruled on as a commission through your planning processes and reliability process. You already do this. This is nothing new to you. But those sorts of processes are very specific to the electric industry and somewhat to the gas industry because of the across state line infrastructure and where supply comes from. Water is very different. We create our own supply for the most part, and it's very specific to regional use. So replacements of lines are more regional and not necessarily across grids that cover a state and or multi-state. So it's a very different process. That's why it's been maintained separately.
One last question, please,
Yeah.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Slater, is it your intent that bringing this planning process to the table by consensus must include the water companies?
Yes, I believe it must include the
Can
water.
you explain why?
The utilities. So the DSIC by itself is a reactive mechanism. I think we should have a proactive approach to all utility distribution planning. While I understand that there may have been rules in 2012, I don't believe that those rules go to the level that perhaps should be considered. And I believe it's important to have all the utilities, Class A water utilities, at the table when we're talking about, rules and regulations. Each utility may act differently, but that does not mean that we shouldn't have a distribution plan for all the utilities. It's in terms of safety and reliability and at a reasonable cost. Well, I don't know how much lead pipe Artesian has left to replace, but that's probably a pretty good thing to know. Or the asbestos around it. I mean, those are important factors, and I think that we should that everyone should know that. So I think distribution planning should be all three utilities. It's exactly what Senator Simpson had requested. He was very happy. The reason it passed unanimously in the Senate is because I said that water utilities should be included. I believe that was the intent, and I believe that in terms of safe and adequate and reliable service at a reasonable cost, we should have a distribution plan. And by we, I mean you. You should have a distribution plan to see what the utilities are spending and what they plan on spending. Because like I said, the DSIC itself is a reactive mechanism. Spend the money, show us what you spend it on. I'm saying that we should have a proactive mechanism to know what's coming down the pike.
So, can I just summarize what
Sure.
I've heard? So, I tend to agree that, or I would say it differently. I disagree that the regulations or proposed regulations should be issued before you sit down for your first meeting by consensus, especially if you're asking for another year through September 2019. I think there's plenty of time to come back and talk about publication. And that overcomes at least one hurdle from one of the testimonies here today. With respect to the water companies, I don't see a harm in asking the water companies to participate in this process. Again, you may find that this attempt to force fit these regulations around all different sectors is not workable, and so you'll diverge or retain what you have along the way. I don't know exactly how to suggest for the commission we handle the order in front of us today. I think that there's a lot of changes on the fly. I'd be much more comfortable coming back to this matter in another session to reconsider it when it's cleaned up a little bit. But Mr. Spate?
If I might, no harm. No harm is a relative term to use, and I've heard it used here, what are we afraid of? The water utilities aren't afraid of any of this. In fact, we look at our systems to make sure that we're replacing mains based upon breaks, based upon where we believe the best use of dollars getting out the older infrastructure is. And I heard, well, we need to know how much asbestos cement pipe is out there. We can tell you how much asbestos cement pipe is out there. That's a far cry different than putting out an entire plan around how you're going to change each piece of that in each given system that are fragmented across the state. Much different plan than, oh, we just need to know. In terms of harm, we're talking about participating in a process amongst disparate utilities that have very different reliability standards and different infrastructure associated with their respective DSIC applications, and grouping us all together in a lump sum and asking us to pay for everybody around here that's going to participate, including consultants, including whatever else is brought to bear to prove out what is right or wrong in regulations. Water utilities shouldn't have to pay for the cost of the implementation of the electric and gas utilities implementation of legislation. That was not the intent. It says it clearly in the legislation. The intent of this is to implement their legislation. We have a different section, different administrative regulations out there. We're abiding by them. Today, you'll rule on some issues related to those regulations. They were put in place to make sure that we implement it. There's audit processes. Every 6 months, you're allowed to, if we didn't do something correctly, if something wasn't installed correctly, you have an entire regulatory process to take away or counter what was put into place. Those are already there. They do not exist for this legislation. That's why this proposal should be limited to the electric and gas legislation. The harm is the cost, time, and energy is involved in putting us into something right now associated with the DSIC legislation that's inappropriate at this time. If we want to come back to how much lead pipe we have, how much asbestos cement pipe we have, how much cast iron pipe we have, we are happy to sit down and go through that with you. But as part of this regulatory process, inappropriate as far as the water utilities are concerned. And I should speak for myself because I don't know if my brethren are here. I'm sorry, Artesian Water is concerned.
I was gonna say, I don't see anybody else up there
Yeah.
yet.
I'll, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman,
yes.
make a brief comment?
Okay. Can you come forward? This is Suez Water.
I get two
Oh,
mics.
here comes Tide Water. There you go.
We're just sitting back there.
Just 1 minute, can Commissioner Drexler
Before you
speak?
start, this is for Mr. O'Brien. You mentioned that you are in consensus with Delmarva regarding its version of Order 9242. Is that correct?
Yes, that is
And
correct,
and the
Commissioner.
reason I'm asking you is because, and correct me if I'm wrong, the alternate draft order that you proposed includes those regulations attached, but the attachment that Mr. Goodman just presented to us does not.
Yeah.
And that's not the only difference. There are also different paragraphs. So what are your comments?
Yes,
there?
let me explain, Commissioner Drexler. Thank you for that question. This agenda for today was published late on Tuesday. It was posted late on Tuesday. Wednesday, of course, was the July 4th holiday. When we came in on Thursday, we immediately contacted staff and DPA, having seen the posted agenda item, to try to get a copy of the proposed order, because that is one thing that was not on Delafile, was the proposed order. It was not available to us or anyone, I believe, until Friday. At that point, with the meeting coming up Tuesday, frankly, we assumed that the water utilities and Delmarva had already been consulted on the order. So what we proposed were the bare minimum changes just for Chesapeake, because there is a mistake in the proposed order regarding Chesapeake's agreement or commitment to participate in the meetings that were set up under the Delmarva Power Agreement. We think that that mistake is a very important thing to point out. And I can go through that right now if there's any chance that the originally proposed order is going to get passed today, because we do need that mistake changed.
Let's put that on, let's shelf that for now. So I guess what is your position, my follow-up question is, what is your position now in terms of, I guess this is hypothetical, but would you agree that those regulations should not be attached at this point? Or would you want them attached as your draft order has them?
No, we would recommend strongly that they not be attached. They
That's
not
what
be
I thought.
published and not be attached to the order because of some of the issues that Mr. Goodman pointed out, and that this is just the beginning of the process. There's nothing wrong with using that document as a starting point once we hit that first meeting, but there would be something wrong for an order to have that attached to it and associated with the commission, as if you had looked through it and thought it was appropriate, at least at this stage in the proceeding.
Thank you. And just before we start, just to be very clear, Mr. Spate, you are objecting both to order number 9242, and which approves the joint motion, and to the joint motion. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think
Commissioner Correa has a question.
Right. The proposed order, 9242, the revised one, essentially opens the docket. That's what DPA wants and needs, and the commission, I as a commissioner would like to do that. The question I have is that even though someone didn't call someone, I presume that your people would be at the leg hall on June 30th up to 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, really. Your people were there, or would have been there. And so the water companies people, government relations people, lobbyists would be there, and no one of you approach the caucus, the committees, and the legislature, both houses. So isn't it little late now to say that, even though I agree that they might not have called you 2 days ahead, they might not have done this, but that is a secondary and little different kind of a point. All this order number does, all this order does is to open a docket. There are procedural problems or relationship problems or calling problems or what have you, but I am more like looking at the broad objective of the public advocate. I look at the order as hey, we are opening the order, we are going to meeting next week, and we will start talking about it. That's what I see, even though including the item you have objected to. So,
But if I might, there's one thing factually incorrect about what you just stated. We weren't part of any of that process. It never related to the water utilities. No input, had no reason to discuss anything with these gentlemen with regard to implementation of the legislation. So there was no ability of us to foresee that an order would come out on a Friday before this commission hearing, noting that we were part of some sort of administrative action. None. So whether or not we had legislative people at Leg Hall for whatever reason, we did not participate in this legislation, nor did we have input to any of the discussions that were being had.
And if I may respond as well, Your Honor? Is it okay? It's gotten a little confusing because the only people allowed in the Democratic caucus, which is what was discussed, are state employees. So I couldn't be in there. It's true. Mr. Slater was in there. Okay. No one from Delmarva Power was in there. That simple. And we weren't there until June. I forget when this was passed. I think it was early June. But no, we were not there. But but your points are very good. You said, well, why don't we just open the docket and move forward? That's exactly what Delmarva wants to do. And we submitted a different version of Order 9242, and it just says exactly what's in the letter that's signed by all the parties, not including the water companies. The water companies shouldn't be involved in the electric side of it. If they work something out, that's fine, but they can't be involved in very different businesses. So we want to open the docket. We want to open it pursuant to our version of Order 9242, which I only handed up to you now because I didn't know about this. I didn't get none of these the proposed order wasn't available until this morning. Maybe it was on Sunday, I don't know, but on Friday, all you could get was the petition. That's yesterday, Gina, that's your point. So anyway, I put this together, and it does exactly what you said. It doesn't publish rules that clearly aren't going to be the rules. It just says, let's do what we all agreed to. Let's work together, put together a proposal for the commission, and I don't think, I would be surprised if it took us until September 1st, 2019 to come forward with rules that you can now start to publish. We want to move forward and move forward quickly. In fact, we gave 2 dates when we can have our whole team to sit down before July 31st and get going on this. That's our intent. Now, I think most people here would agree that you're not going to have one meeting where you're going to do the rules for electric, gas, and water. They're going to have to break up. Electric's going to be very, very complicated and very extensive, and we've done it in other states, and we'll bring those extensive rules in as a starting point. And then gas will be different, and water, I have no idea. I know it's completely different. So this is gonna be a process, but we wanna start right away with electric and gas. And if you look at our form of order, that's what we ask. We think it's a good thing to open the docket. Let's get it open and move forward and do this the way we all agreed to.
If
I have just one question of Mr. Spate. I understand exactly the difference with water plus the other two. But is there anything that can, and maybe the other water companies could answer also, is there any listing of ABC rules that would be the same that could apply to all three utilities? Basic, whatever.
If you look in the Regulation 1009, there's a whole series of regulations that already exist for water utilities that are
Yes.
A, B, C, and D.
All right,
You
but
can
would-
start with that with the electrics and gas.
Would they
but
also transfer to electric and gas?
Some of them will. Some of them won't, because
Okay.
some of them are very specific to water utilities and how they're adjudicated.
But there are some that could be pulled out that would apply to all three.
Sure, the application process and that sort of
Okay.
thing, the time element, maybe when projects are to be completed, those sorts of rules exist. But everything else is very specific to water utilities and why the DSIC application or implementation was done for them.
So
But
what-
this whole business of this reliability standards rose out of the electric industry's, reliability standards that you guys
Yeah.
have
Oh, yeah.
adjudicated. So,
So what you would see would be like ABC over here that goes to everybody, and then, let's see if we can do this alphabetically. Electric, gas, and water would then be three separate entities under.
the administration process already has those separated, and the water has its own set of rules specific to it.
Yes.
There is another one for electric, and then another one for gas utilities as well. They have not set those up to implement their DSIC legislation. We already have administrative process in place specific to us.
Okay.
This reliability standard has nothing to do with the water legislation. That's the difference here. That's what I'm
All
trying
right,
to.
I'm talking DSIC now.
Okay, just DSIC.
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
And the other thing I would add, just in case it's not clear, is if you look at the administrative code, there is already one section that is dedicated solely to water, another one that is dedicated solely to gas, and then another, so you wouldn't have one that would embody all three, like the
So-
proposed order.
What you're telling me is there is no way to do it.
Not really. Not that I can see.
It would be exceptionally difficult because I envision this as electric being, it's the more complicated business, as you know, how much stuff is before you, whether it be energy efficiency, demand response, rates, SOS. Electric is just a much more intricate and detailed system. I don't know about water. I think I turn it on and it comes out and it's either hot or cold.
Well, that flipped the
and if
switch.
it's- and if it's
Believe me,
artesian,
there's a lot more to
if
it.
it's artesian, it tastes really good.
Yeah, oh.
Sorry, I just met this guy. No, but yeah, it'll be different, and it's a big nut to crack, and it'll be a lot of work, and we're looking forward to moving forward. Part of the initial meeting that we're having it was to sit down and say, how are we going to proceed? You want to do electric first, and then gas? How do you want to proceed, staff? How do you want to proceed, DPA? We have model rules for each. I mean, this is part of our process and our intent, which is why we reached out and asked for dates to begin.
Mr. O'Brien, are you in agreement with those two? The water and the electric, that it should be?
Oh, definitely, yes. And, Chesapeake's not here certainly to protect the water utilities, but we do have an intense interest in protecting appropriate procedures at the commission. And, we won't get into a big argument or a big debate over the importance of distribution planning and what that means to the regulatory compact we have in Delaware and in most states regarding management decisions versus the commission's role as an economic regulator. Where I'm going with this is that it's very important decision whether to bring in the water utilities, and to do it with just the 8 days notice or whatever it was probably isn't appropriate, because there are all kinds of arguments around whether or not the commission should be pre-approving projects, whether or not the water utilities should even be brought in when they weren't part of the conversation at the legislature. So you might decide that it is appropriate to bring in the water utilities, but from Chesapeake's perspective, to do it on such short notice would not be the best practice for the commission.
All right, does either Tidewater or Suez have anything to add to that?
Good afternoon. My name is Kirsten Higgins. I'm with Tidewater Utilities. Respectfully, I don't think Tidewater was given the opportunity to digest this information in the amount of time that we would have liked. The July 4th weekend is a very, very demanding time at Tidewater Utilities. We have high demand in Rehoboth Beach, and a lot of our vice presidents, our managers, were focused on that, on the supply. And as far as all the points that Mr. Spate brought up, in our opinion, the DSIC works and it works well. Mr. Slater said that it was a reactive measure, and it is on its face. However, the commission has very specific rules and audits in place that goes back and looks at every specific project that we've put in. I believe the last commission meeting that I was at, the 2017 D6 were just audited. And there are specific methods put in place that if we over-earn, under-earn, or if the project did not meet the very specific criteria that the commission has already set forth on what type of projects, I just am not convinced right now to see if this is the avenue. If you want us to do more planning, we're certainly open to that. I just don't think that this is the avenue that it needs to be in. You would have to reopen the water-specific DSIC regulations, and I think a one-size-fits-all solution may not work here.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you.
Gary Prettyman from Suez. I just wanted to add that we were not really aware of what was going on and what happened today. This originally started out as electric gas legislation, so we really didn't pay much attention to it. So coming here this morning and hearing all this is a little surprising to me anyway. We at Suez do planning. We plan our construction 1 to 3 years out. But as Mr. Spade said, no matter how good you plan in the water business, things happen. And a lot of things happen. So a lot of the projects then may be pushed off because of the capital budget needs, because you always have to do those emergencies or things you don't think about. So if the commission does want some planning information or information about what we do have out there, we could do that, just, I believe, not as part of this.
Mr. Slater.
So I think I need to correct something. So the regulations that have been discussed that are already in place are not water specific. It's for the UFRC. They do not address distribution planning. Furthermore, distribution planning in general is about service quality and reliability. It's the same thing for all of the utilities. There was a comment about, whether or not they have lobbyists by Commissioner Correa. Yes, they do, and they were in Legislative Hall. I was there till 7:30 in the morning. I did see their lobbyists. And yes, lobbyists and companies do go into caucus. There have been instances with the DSIC where they were called, where companies have been called into caucus, and it's not just state employees. So I worked in the legislature for 9.5 years. I've got a pretty good grasp on that one. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to also say that the PSC annual report that all Class A water utilities are required to submit, I believe, by every April of the year, has a very detailed accounting of all the type of plant that we have, including the type of main, like if it's old, if it's lead. So that might be helpful too.
Are there any, okay, Commissioner Drexler.
This is, Mr. Willard, this is your, does Senate Bill 80, Senate Substitute Number 1 or 2, mention the water companies directly? I'm looking at the amendments, but I don't see that.
Again, I know Tom is working on this.
Oh,
and
Tom.
I'm not really
Okay,
familiar with
Mr.
the
Walsh.
legislation itself. It does list water, I believe.
I don't
It's-
see it.
Well, I mean, my understanding was Mr. Slater talked to the senator about adding
So-
water.
I can address that if you would like.
Yes, thank you.
Commissioner Drexler. So the legislation itself does not mention water utilities. The synopsis of the bill mentions water utilities very specifically, and one of the water utilities specifically weighed in to talk about the DSIC and how it was beneficial to them, and they were asked to weigh in. But the comment is that in the synopsis of the bill itself, it says it talks about the water utilities. In fact, it actually got to a point where I had to inform some of the other utilities that you need to stop talking about the water utilities because you want this for yourself, but instead it was being relied upon. Initially, last year, it was relied upon as we just want what the water utilities have.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the commissioners? Would you like to offer anything? Okay. What is your pleasure, ladies and gentlemen?
Mr. Slater, do you have an issue adopting the order revised by Delmarva Power?
I do not.
You have no issue with that?
No, it does. Oh,
Take a
well, then
moment.
yes, I do, because
All right.
I thought it was including water. I'm sorry, I got this and was reading through it, was read through it pretty fast. Yes, I do, because I think water needs to be included in this docket.
Is there any reason why this process cannot move forward without water, and you bring this issue back to us as you move it forward over the course of the next year, if water is an absolute critical factor to success?
I think it's important to have water at the table to begin with, because I think that there are best practices for all the utilities that can be learned throughout this process. And it's important to have all the utilities at the table so that we can determine best practices together in a collaborative approach, as opposed to trying to, at some point, they will have to be segregated out, right? But initially, I do not believe that they should be segregated out and that they should actually be combined as one. I mean, the other option, nobody's going to like this, but, I mean, I guess the other option is put it back through the legislative process. I mean, we dropped the legislative process because we were going to do this in regulation. And like I said before, the impetus for the water companies was specific to the comment made by the Senate Minority Leader to say, you should do this for water companies too. And so that's the impetus for why I believe that they should be included.
But in that comment, I didn't hear you say you should do this with water companies together. It said that you should do this for water companies too. So the fact that water companies insist on doing it alone, what's the issue in view of that statement?
The comment from Senator Simpson was he liked distribution planning. He liked the agreement that we had come to, and he had specifically said, will you do this? Will you include water utilities? And the answer is yes. We should have them included. I don't think there's any harm in learning best practices about service quality and reliability for all of our utilities and the Class 1 water utilities.
If I might.
Excuse me one sec, Commissioners, if I may. Just want to make sure we're all on the same page. You're talking about the 3-page document, I counted, it's the 7th page of the document that
Yes.
you handed out. I just want to make sure we're all talking from the same document. We say there's several revisions. So is the 7th page,
Of what I handed up, Your Honor.
right, would
Do
you
want to
just
clarify the
identify it?
Absolutely.
That way it'll,
Thank you, Dr. Brewer. So I handed up a document. On the cover of that document
is it highlighted?
is the highlighted of the Title 26. So if you go, it is the second to last document. Each document has a big divider sheet
Yes.
in between. And so the last document is a red line of the order.
Yes.
The document before that is a clean order number 9242. That, and just because there's some confusion, that is Delmarva's proposed order that opens up this docket just for Delmarva Chesapeake. That's it.
And
Except that
that's-
it actually doesn't say that
hold on, I just want to make sure we got the right document. And Commissioner Gray, that's the document you're referring to?
That's not it. That's not it. No, this is, where's your package from? Yeah. Yes, right.
So you know what I did?
Yeah.
In the rush to do this, the caption
Yes,
says.
it says
So-
Water
So maybe if I could recommend the following. This-
Hold on one second. I just want to make sure.
He's got it. I got
That
it.
was the
Okay.
same one. It's just
Yeah.
marked.
Yeah, but this is a clean.
Yes.
Is just that,
It's actually, yes,
Yeah.
next to the last one.
Correct, okay.
so what I wanted to say is that Delmarva and apparently Chesapeake wants to move forward. So if we can, if we pass this to the next meeting, we can clean up the caption, and I can get comments back on this document from staff and DPA. And as my father used to say, you gotta eat the elephant one bite at a time. And electric and gas are two big elephants. So let's start with those and get this done and start moving forward. And whatever the issues are with DPA and water, they can work that out. They can come in and try and do their own. But we want to move forward, and we're planning on moving forward. So let's go. We want to get going.
With all due respect, I was beginning a comment, and I just wanted to finish the one comment. With respect to Mr. Slater and a conversation with a single senator, or Mr. Simpson, rather. With all due respect, the legislation was passed by the entirety of the legislature, not a single person. And the intent of that legislation was all around electric and gas. I don't know what one conversation was had or wasn't had, but we generally come here to the regulating body to govern how we do our regulation and going forward. And the legislature tells you essentially how they want you to put together regulations. This regulation and this legislation said specifically the intent was to put regulations in to implement this legislation. We're not part of it. It's as simple as that. I don't know what the conversation was between Mr. Slater and Mr. Simpson, but that's one legislator. We had a whole body that voted on this. Thank you.
I believe that we need to come to an end with this discussion, and I would like to know what the pleasure of this commission is now, please.
I would like to propose that we approve the order number 9242. And the one I'm referring to is the one that was presented in the package of information with the divider sheets by Delmarva this morning that specifically references the law that establishes the DSIC for electric and natural gas companies in Delaware and agrees to start those discussions. And that's the one that I think we should approve because of all the discussion.
Now, the
point of
caption on that also includes water utilities.
It does not.
It does.
Mine does.
Mine-
Natural gas and water utilities.
Correct. In the caption,
Yes.
in the rush to, get this done, I did not strike that. And maybe the counsel for the commission can say, is it legitimate for you to strike that manually? I don't know.
I think if you make a motion
Oh.
saying you approve this, but strike those two words, that would be appropriate.
Electric and water only and not including the water.
Water only.
Yes.
Strike
Would-
with those two words stricken, water utilities.
Is
I
your
s- I
second, sir?
second it.
Any questions on the motion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you. Mr. Chair, it's
Thank you.
yours.
Number two on the agenda is in the matter of the request for proposals and the review and approval of any proposed contracts for the purchase of wind-generated renewable energy credits by Delmarva Power and Light. We want to consider Delmarva's request for approval of an RFP. Mr. Goodman, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Luckily, this had nothing to do with caucuses, so you can be involved. I filed this, thanks in large part to one of my favorite analysts in the world, Ms. Knotts. She pointed out that the approval that this commission gave of the RFP before was only for the first tranche of the, I should start at the beginning, because I'm sorry, I'm just tired. And I'm sure you're even more tired. As you know, when you approved the merger of Exelon and Delmarva Power, one of the things that you approved was that Delmarva Power would do 3 different RFPs for wind renewable energy credits for purposes of meeting its renewable portfolio standard requirements. We conducted the first one, and unfortunately, the lowest bidder backed out at the last minute. Could not get approval from its foreign parent company for the required security. And what that security does is protects our customers if they cannot provide the promised product. And because, for instance, let's say REC prices go up, they're selling to us for $10 a REC, and they can go get it on the market for $15 a REC. So they say, forget you guys, we're going to go get the money. Well, guess what? We got your security of millions of dollars that now goes to our customers to protect them. They were not able to provide that. So nothing happened there. You had approved the RFP for that. So when they backed out, we were now up against the wall of having to start the second tranche of the RFP. And so we issued that. And then Ms. Knotts said, boy, I think maybe you need to get that one approved as well. We went back and looked and said, oh gosh, we made a mistake. And we tried to make that very clear in our application. So we went right to the Renewable Energy Task Force, who saw the couple small changes in the RFP that we made, and they said, yes, we consent. And then we brought it right to you. The changes we have attached to a document in a red line format, very minor changes to the RFP that you already approved. Change number one is because the first tranche of 40 wasn't successful, we are giving bidders an option. The second tranche is supposed to be 40 as well, so they're going to fulfill that in their bids. And if they want to, they can provide another up to 40 megawatt bid. And if those prices are good, if all the prices are good, we decide, hey, we think this is a good deal too. We're going to take both of the 40s to the commission where a full docket will take place. Full notice, full analyzation, probably maybe experts, depends on what staff and DPA want to do to make sure that these are good contracts. So there's that change. And then the other change is we kind of learned our lesson on the security provisions the last time, so we provided some more options for providing security. So just 2 little changes, and we're here asking your approval of something that admittedly is already out. And the good news is that we're getting some good bids. So, and now there was some interesting comments filed by Mr. Myers. And I will say this, as I was able to interpret his concerns, and I had a hard time figuring it out, but I think he's afraid that when it comes time to, if we bring you contracts for approval, and that later on, could it be this year, could be next year, or whenever, a freeze is called, which caps any further increases in the RPS percentage, that will be oversubscribed. We'll have these long-term 10-year contracts for RECs. And I can assure you that we will not be oversubscribed. The reason we went out for 3 40-watt tranches over this time period, Merrick wanted us to do the 120 up front, and we said no. If we were to contract for 120 RECs up front and there was a freeze, we'd be stuck, right? We'd be charging customers for things they don't need. So that's how we spread it out 40 at a time over like a 6 or 8 year period, because the RPS increases go up. So if we came to you and you approved 40 and a 40, you have our word, and we'll prove this to you when the time comes, when we're here asking for approval, that if a cap comes in, we will not be oversubscribed. So I think that hopefully that would allay any concerns Mr. Myers has about that. And we have been very careful in that regard. And I know that we will continue to work with Ms. Knotts because she wants to be sure of that as well. And I know that'll be part of the issue if and when we do bring you contracts. So my message here is just, we thought of that a long time ago. We thought of that when we brought the merger agreement to you, and that's why it's split up over a period of years into small 40 megawatt chunks, just so we will not be oversubscribed.
Thank you, Mr. Goodman. Mr. Walsh?
Thank you, Chairman, Commissioners, staff.
went through this very closely and worked with Ms. Knotts in putting together a memorandum, which we noted those changes. The only, two that I would mention that are in our memo that Mr. Goodman didn't mention, just was, one was the update of the, putting the current dates in there, and then the other was, it was amended to allow bidders to submit more than one proposal for a generating facility, provided that each proposal pertains to a different portion of that facility. Doesn't carry the day, but I just wanted to mention it. Ms. Knotts and I discussed it and thought it was appropriate to have that in there as part of the key changes in there. We support the application, Marva's request to approve tranche 2 request for proposals, and we state, as we stated in our memo, we believe it's consistent with paragraph 84 of the amended settlement agreement. It is in line with the previous orders approved by this commission, and it has had RETF approval, and we support the application and respectfully request that the commission approve.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Mr. Noyes?
Thank you, Chair Winslow and Commissioners. I think Delmarva Power and staff have done a good job of summarizing what's before you. DENREC also supports the application, and if any technical issues come up, I would be willing to speak to them, but I won't prolong the proceedings.
Thank you, Mr. Noyes. Ms. Iori?
Thank you, Chair Winslow, Commissioners. The DPA takes no position on the application or the proposed form of order.
Commissioners, any questions?
One quick question, Mr. Chair. Thank you. So if you do, in the future year, come across a cost gap for whatever reason, is there in the contract something that would allow cancellation or modification of your commitment?
No, Your Honor, and the reason is because the way the cost cap works, so as you know, percentages that we have to meet a certain percentage of our load by rec, one rec being 1 megawatt, and it goes up every year, so every year we need more and more recs. If there's a freeze or cost cap, what that does is it says from this year forward, there will be no more percentage increases, right? So if, and I apologize for not knowing, I think someone probably knows, I bet her name is Pamela Knotts, what the exact percentage is this year. Is it 13.5%?
For 2017 compliance year, it's 16 and I think 1.25.
Okay, so 16% on our way to 25% by year 25. We will not contract for more than we would need if a freeze was put into effect. So let's say a freeze is put into effect now. That would just mean that next year it doesn't go up beyond 16%. Just stays flat at 60%. And we will not bring to you any long-term contracts that would stick us at having to buy more than 16%. And the reason is that no company would enter into a long-term contract that could be canceled like that.
Yep.
So we just limit how much we would enter into, so we'll never put us or our customers or your honors in that awkward situation.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. No further questions, Mr. Chair.
I have a comment. On the staff memo, Ms. Knotts, you have explained it so specifically and precisely that I like to read your recommendation again and again. So thank you for the good job.
Thank you.
I thank her again.
Would you like to commend the commander by making a motion?
I was about to do that, Mr. Chairman. I move that we accept the staff recommendation on proposal for review and approval of this memo.
Proposed order 9244.
I second.
Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, any abstentions, the motion carries. Thank you, everyone. Number
Thank you.
3 is in the matter of the application of Suez Water Delaware, Inc. concerning their DSIC Mr. Prettyman. Welcome, Mr. Prettyman.
Thank you, Chairman.
It's nice to see you occasionally.
Thank you, nice to be here. Yeah, first of all, thank you, Gary Prettyman from Suez. Thank you for considering our motion. Very briefly, the disc that we filed for the construction that was placed in service from November to April was filed 3 business days after the statutory period, which, as we said in our motion, we didn't realize at the time it was statutory due to staffing changes. Not that that's a reason, but that is what happened. It's the first time it's ever happened. In our motion and in a letter, we did request that to allow time for review, that the disc rates that we had filed become effective on September 1st, allowing 2 months to review the information. The other, and that would only, just to clarify on the advocate's comments, there would be no additional investment included in those rates. It's exactly the same investment from November to April, and I believe your comments had through August. In addition, if the commission decides that they cannot do that because of statute, the other part of the request is that when we file for the discharge to become effective in January, that this investment from November to April also be included, as DISC is meant to be a cumulative effect of investment placed in service to serve the customers.
Thank you, Mr. Prettyman. Mr. Walsh?
Thank you, Chairman, and Commissioners. This, unfortunately, is a matter of, and I don't say this in a derogatory sense, the motion, it's one of futility simply because the Commission doesn't have the authority to allow a late filing of DSEC. The Commission has no discretion either under the statute or the rules. The statute, section 314, I'll reference it, Title 26, of course, it is mandatory. Now, it starts, of course, with permissive. The utility may file for a change in the DSIC rates. And if it does, then you have all the mandatory provisions. And among them are that the effective date of changes shall be January 1st and July 1st each year. Utility shall file any request at least 30 days prior to its effective date. And the DSIC rate shall be adjusted semi-annually. These are mandatory provisions with express time limitations. That is the statute that controls. There is no provision in any part of section 314 which allows for the Commission to allow in its discretion a later filed DSIC application. There are many statutes in Delaware Code that have discretion for an agency to allow filing beyond the stated time period. This one doesn't have any. Also consider the fact that there's no discretion in the administrative code. The applicable section administrative code 1009.4.1 states staff will review each DSIC application to ensure compliance with the provisions of section 314. It's not in compliance with 314. The other more broad sweeping part of the administrative code, 1001.1.92, states that upon good cause shown, the Commission may extend the period of time prescribed by these rules. That time period is not by these rules, it's by the statute. It's very specific. There, in my research of this, I looked at several cases that comport with exactly what we are opposing here, the granting of this motion. One, which I thought was interesting, was the case of Atwell versus Delaware Violent Crimes Compensation Board. And the court there pointed out the fact that while the agency had the discretion under the statute to allow a filing more than a year later, the fact that it did not allow it was not an abuse of discretion. And there are citations to cases where the board would, an agency had gone beyond that and allowed it, and the courts said, creatures of statute, the statute governs, and if it doesn't provide for your discretion to allow, enlarge the time period, you can't do it. If you do it, you're expanding your jurisdiction, and that can't be done. So I don't want to belabor the point. There is no authority to extend the time period. The alternative requests, 314 doesn't allow for either one of the alternative requests that Mr. Prettyman mentioned, allowing them to group their prior DSIC rates in later filings. It's an unfortunate result for Suez, but the courts are very strict with this. There's a 10-day time period. You file on day 11, you're late. The court doesn't have jurisdiction. And the statute controls that. And 314 controls this. It doesn't allow for discretion, and it doesn't allow for the commission to exercise or expand its authority to allow this DSIC filing. So staff opposes and requests that, or would pray that the commission reject the motion for consideration due to the fact that there is no authority to grant it.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Ms. Iori?
Well, thank you, Chair Winslow and Commissioners. I am not going to repeat what Mr. Walsh said. The DPA agrees with staff's position on this for the reasons that Mr. Walsh cited. I want to make this perfectly clear. We are not opposing it because we don't like Suez or because we want to be difficult or, because they're, I mean, we understand it's a harsh result. And if the statute didn't exist, it's very likely that we would not be opposing it. But the problem is the statute does exist, and the statute doesn't give the commission the authority to extend the deadline. I did point out in our papers, and this is the only thing I'll add that's different from what Mr. Walsh said, we identified other sections in the Public Utilities Act where the commission is specifically authorized to extend deadlines. This is not one of those sections, and if the General Assembly had intended to give the commission discretion to extend it, it would have said so. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Iori. Mr. Prettyman, any more comments?
Just one, and we understand completely what both staff and Ms. Iori said about the statute after rereading everything, which we didn't realize it was a statute. The other part of our request, though, however, is to include this investment when we file in January, and that, I think we believe, at least, that you do have the ability to do that.
Ms. Iori has some comments on that.
Yeah, I know.
I do have comments on that. That would be retroactive rate making. You cannot go back and include in current rates something that should have been included in previous rates but was not. When Suez next comes in for a rate case, that amount, that 6 months of investment will be included in its rate base. But to go back and include it in the DSIC when next when they next file it, would be retroactive rate making. And it would also be allowing them to kind of get in the back door what they can't get now. They can't get it now because they were late filing. I know it's a harsh result, but you can't come in the next one and say, oh yeah, okay, you can get it this time. That's basically, is no, there's no harm, basically, no harm, no foul. And we respectfully submit that, well, there is a foul and there is harm.
Commissioners, any questions? Commissioner Gray.
I'll just make the motion that we deny Suez's motion.
I second it.
Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed, any abstentions, the motion carries.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
I would like, before Mr. Prettyman leaves, if you can bear with me, there's an issue that was brought to my attention about a water main break in Edgemore. I think it was around the 4th of July. Could you share with the commission for the next 2 minutes or so what Suez's response reaction was to that incident, and could it have been handled any better?
Okay. I just wanted to get some of my notes. The main break, it was on River Road near Edgemore Gardens on July 5th. We anticipated at this time, well, not anticipated a main break, but it was an 8-inch main. We replaced about 13 feet of that main. We believe initially that it was just due to the stress of the July 4th week put onto the system. There were about 450 customers that were out of service for about 12 hours. We immediately put a notice on the inbound phone calls to customer service, and we put notices on all of our social media. We were also in contact with the Newcastle County Emergency Operations and State Representative Deb Heffernan's office.
You might want to add Senator Harris McDowell to your contact list. I think he represents that area.
Okay.
He called the commission, I believe, with respect to the issue and wanted to get more information because he had heard one thing initially, then he understood that the facts might have changed in some fashion, and so I think there is some disconnect between his office and the water company.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, Sam is available for that part of the discussion if you ask to hear from him.
Well, I have just a couple of follow-ups, and we can do a wrap on this. But are all of these customers fully restored?
Yes.
And what's the measure of losses and outstanding liabilities still remaining from the incident?
Meaning the cost of the repair?
Well, are customers having any liability or damage as a result?
Not that I've been told, no.
Okay. And is there anything Suez could have done better or differently?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate that information.
Mr. Slater?
If you'll allow, Mr. Chair and Commissioners, I'd like a follow-up question.
Sure, go ahead.
All right. So I just want to make the point that I don't think my office was aware. So in the future, I would like to be notified. We get a lot of phone calls, and as does staff, and I want to make sure that we're alerted in the future, especially when we get inquiries or media inquiries. That's really important to us.
I agree with that.
And then, not to say what is your plan, but
we're not in that legislation.
But I will say, what is your plan? Because when these people are out all day and it's 85 or 90 degrees outside, I was kind of hoping that you were going to be providing them water or some sort of sustenance in the meantime. And it's my understanding that the only way that they got that is if they called. And I think that needs to be a proactive measure by Suez to reach out to their customers. Surely there's some sort of database to try and get them some water, because if it's 85 or 90 degrees outside and there's a senior citizen or really anybody, I don't want them being dehydrated or have something worse happen. So thank you.
I will check on that.
Do you have any comments, Sam?
Well, I just want to add, so I was off on Thursday. Many people were off the holiday week. But I learned about this incident via Twitter and also because we had customers calling us here at the commission. And then I had a call from the media, which I was not prepared for. We did speak to Suez later that day, and we were told that if customers called the customer service number, that they have cards on their person, they could go to 7-Eleven and get them water. But I would like to echo the advocate and say that I don't think customers know that. We did put something out on our Facebook, but I didn't see any further comments to that nature on Suez's Twitter or Facebook page. So I think we just need to, Senator McDowell had called me Friday night at 6 o'clock because he said that first he heard it was just a couple hundred and then he heard it was several more. And I couldn't actually answer that question until today, how many people were affected. And he said he's just very concerned and would think that on a hot day that we'd be proactive to be out there maybe with a water truck or something of
Right.
that nature in the future.
No, I agree, and I know as a company, I'm not sure about this incident, but we have done that in other places when something like this happens.
And it's also the 2nd Senate District, which is currently represented by Senator Marshall, but will have someone new in November. It's a combination of Senator McDowell and Senator Marshall.
Okay. Chairman, is Senator Marshall who you mentioned?
I mentioned Senator McDowell because
McDowell.
he's the one who called.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
No further questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Pettigrew.
You're welcome. Thank you. all.
Thank you, Mr. Prettyman. Next, we have a hearing schedule in the matter of the application of Chesapeake Utilities Corporation for approval of natural gas expansion service offerings. We're going to consider proposed order number 9246. Mr. Nutter, are you going to carry the ball for this one?
Certainly, Your Honor. Well, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, James Nutter on behalf of Chesapeake. I'm with Parkowski, Gerken, Swayze, and Chesapeake's the applicant in this matter. We do have for consideration of the commission a proposed settlement that will resolve all outstanding matters in this docket. By way of introduction, the settlement will authorize Chesapeake to utilize 3 new rate classes that are very similar to rates that the commission has already approved and found just and reasonable. The rates in this case, in this docket that are being submitted for approval are underserved area rates, and those would be applicable and Chesapeake could utilize when necessary to make economic expansion to areas where Chesapeake has service now, but it may not be economic under its existing tariff and line extension policies. And those underserved area rates are very similar to the infrastructure expansion service rates that the commission applied in order number 8479, and those were with respect to a designated expansion area in eastern Sussex County, and that order was entered in November 5th of 2013. After all the other parties have made their opening statements, we're prepared to offer testimony of Matthew Everingham with Chesapeake. He will go through the relevant terms of the settlement agreement and be prepared to answer any questions that the commission may have.
Does any other party have any opening statement, or should we go straight forward to the testimony?
No opening statement.
No opening statement.
Mr. Nutter.
Thank you. And then Chesapeake would call Matthew Everingham.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Good afternoon, Mr. Everingham. Can you please tell the commission your job title and duties with Chesapeake?
Yes, my name is Matthew Evergam. I'm the manager of pricing and regulatory affairs. Sorry. Matthew Evergam with Chesapeake Utilities, the manager of pricing and regulatory affairs. Some of my job responsibilities with the company, which are directly related to this item in front of the commission today, are oversight of rate design and project feasibility analysis.
In your capacity as the manager of pricing and regulatory affairs, are you familiar generally with Chesapeake's commission-approved rates and line extension
Yes, I am.
policies? And are you also familiar with the infrastructure expansion rates that the commission approved for the expansion area?
Yes.
Can you just briefly describe where the expansion area is and what those IES rates involve?
The IES rates were designed to be able to serve previously uneconomic expansion in the eastern Sussex area. The geographical boundaries of that are defined in our tariff, but in general it is the area around Lewis and the surrounding area of eastern Sussex County.
And did you also participate in proceedings in this docket, including the development of the settlement agreement and the proposed underserved area rates being submitted for commission approval?
Yes, I did.
Would you briefly describe for areas outside of Chesapeake's expansion area, how Chesapeake assesses potential expansion projects from an economic perspective?
Yes, we create a project feasibility analysis to determine whether a project is economic under the company's standard tariff rates for the potential customer to be added for that specific project. All projects must be economic for the company to move forward with those, and they must meet the company's rate of return model.
And would you just briefly describe the economic test? You mentioned the company's rate of return model.
To put it simply, basically looks at the anticipated revenues from the expansion project from the customers, puts that against the expected expenses that the company would incur, and then looks at the rate of return that would be required based on the company's authorized rate of return and the capital invested in the project. So it would look at those three buckets and make sure that the project is economically feasible.
Please explain for the members of the commission the proposed underserved area rates that have been agreed to as part of the settlement agreement and the type of customer to whom those would apply.
The broad overview of the three rate classes, it's the underserved area R, which is residential, provides service for all residential customers under that rate schedule. The underserved area general service rate, which would be for smaller commercial customers, and then the underserved area medium volume service rate, which would be for medium volume commercial and industrial customers.
And how do these proposed underserved area rates differ from the Chesapeake standard tariff rates?
They utilize Chesapeake standard tariff rates as the basis for the rates, and then there is an additional amount added to the monthly customer charge on each of the individual rate classes.
And is that additional customer rate for the underserved area rate being proposed the same for each of the customer classes?
Yes, it is. It is the same for each of the customer classes. It would be an additional $25.50 on the customer charge for each of the three rate classes.
If the settlement agreement presented to the commission is approved, how will Chesapeake implement the underserved area rates throughout its service territory outside of its existing expansion area?
The company would continue to use the economic test as we currently utilize for any project to look at these standard tariff rates to see if it would meet the economic return. If it did not, the company would look at that utilizing the underserved area rates and see if the underserved area rates would make the project economic. If so, the company would offer the customer the option of utilizing the underserved area rates to move forward with service and construction of the extension of facilities.
So are the underserved area rates being presented to the commission a voluntary option for customers?
Yes, they are. Customer could choose to utilize the underserved area rates if those rates make the project economic. They could still utilize the option that they currently have for uneconomic projects where a one-time contribution to native construction would be paid up front, and then they would utilize the standard tariff rates that we currently have. Or if neither of those options proved to be palatable to the customer, they would choose to not take service.
If a customer does elect to take service pursuant to the underserved area rate, how long will the underserved area rate be assessed and collected?
Yes, the underserved area rate does have a sunset on it as far as how long the customer would pay, which would be 13 years after the service is turned on and the meter starts to flow gas and they start to take service from the company, after which time it would revert back to the standard tariff rates.
Will the underserved area rate also be assessed to any other premises that may be added later as a result of a main extension that is initially made economic through use of the underserved area rate?
Yes. One of the concerns of all the parties involved in discussions was basically that if there was an extension that was made and needed to utilize these rates in order to make it economic, that someone wouldn't be able to piggyback off those higher rates paid by a certain customer and, get a free ride or be subsidized. So any customer addition off an extension that has to be paid for through the underserved area rates would also pay the underserved area rates for the same period of time.
Under the settlement agreement, can the underserved area rates be utilized to acquire community gas systems that are currently being served by propane?
No. Parties have agreed that the commission would have to specifically authorize any use of underserved area rates in the acquisition of community gas system as a part of a separate proceeding.
Can you briefly describe the reporting requirements that Chesapeake has agreed to as part of the settlement agreement?
Yes, Chesapeake has agreed in the proposed settlement agreement to prepare and to file a comprehensive report detailing the revenues, the number of new customers added, and the associated capital expenditures for each expansion project where the USA rates are utilized, and the rate of return model or net revenue test reports for each such expansion project. Format is designed to allow DPA and staff to readily assess whether the expansion projects are producing the required rate of return projected by Chesapeake in its initial analysis.
And why would it be important to know if expansion projects are meeting their required rate of return?
One of the concerns by both the DPA and the PSC staff, as well as the company, is that we want to ensure that the company's projections are accurate and that these projects meet the required rate of return so that we're not putting any undue burden on the existing customer rate base. We want all expansion projects to be able to support themselves and not be subsidized. So therefore, that's why we have this reporting requirement so that all parties are able to openly see and assess whether that has happened or not.
And are there provisions in the settlement agreement designed to protect Chesapeake's existing ratepayers from the risks that individual projects or Chesapeake's aggregate portfolio of projects do not produce their required rate of return?
Yes, to address the concern that all parties had about whether or not the projects were meeting the required rate of return and to ensure that there was no subsidization by the existing rate base. The parties have agreed that the Chesapeake will be held to the revenues and rate of return projected in its feasibility analysis for the expansion projects where the underserved area rates are utilized. For rate-making purposes, in the company's next rate case proceeding, should the Chesapeake expansion area projects fail to produce the required rate of return, revenues would be imputed into Chesapeake's base rate proceeding to meet the revenue estimates that the company had projected in its project feasibility analysis.
There is also a provision in the settlement agreement whereby Chesapeake agrees to offer support in its next base rate proceeding for how it calculates the A&G expenses in its revenue models. Can you just briefly tell the Commission why that is believed to be significant?
Yes, during the settlement discussions, when we looked at the company's rate of return models, there was a question brought up by, I believe it was the DPA's witness, I could be incorrect on that, about whether the A&G, the administrative and general expenses that are imputed into the revenue requirements and into the rate of return model are the appropriate level dollars if we've appropriated the correct proportion into the model. We agreed with staff and with DPA that in the next base rate proceeding, we would present support for the exact amount of dollars to be placed in, which would then be obviously open to discussion and interpretation from staff and the DPA in that proceeding.
Commissioners, I don't have any further questions for the witness, but I'll turn them over to yourselves if you do.
Mr. Everham, is the settlement in the best interest of the people of the state of Delaware and specifically your customers?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Willard?
Yeah, we need to move for the admission of the 7 exhibits that are attached to the order as well. I don't think that was done yet.
That was not.
Any objection to the admission of the 7 exhibits?
No objection.
Mr. Willard, there's no objection from you, I assume?
No.
They are admitted into evidence, 1 through 7. Mr. Willard?
Yes, staff agrees with the settlement. Mr. Jason Smith is here to testify about staff's position on this.
Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Okay, Mr. Smith, would you please give your full name and a business address to the commission?
Yes, my name is Jason R. Smith. My business address is 861 Silver Lake Boulevard, Suite 100, Dover, Delaware.
And how long have you been with the commission?
I've been with the commission for 8 years.
And your current title?
I'm a Public Utility Analyst 3.
All right, in that capacity, have you had a chance to participate in this docket before the commission today?
Yes, I have.
And could you tell how you participated? Did you have a role, and if so, what was your role?
Yes, I was assigned as the case manager, which basically means I've managed every aspect of this case on behalf of staff. This has included reviewing and analyzing the application, preparing and reviewing various discovery and other data, participation in any conference calls, formulating staff's position, and assisting in the development of testimony, reviewing other parties' testimonies, and reviewing basically any other relevant correspondence in this matter.
And I assume you had the opportunity to review staff's testimony in this case as well?
Yes, I did.
Now, there's an exhibit law containing 7 exhibits, of which exhibits 5 and 6 are the public and confidential versions of the direct testimony of staff's expert witness, Mr. Dwight D. Etheridge. I believe you said you reviewed them, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
With regard to those testimonies, are you adopting them as part of staff's position in support of the settlement?
Yes, I am.
Now, you were also a participant in the development of the settlement agreement that we have given to the commission this afternoon, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Can you, on the record, give us your opinion with regard to whether you think the settlement agreement is in the public interest?
Yes, I believe it is in the public interest. It's just and reasonable. I believe that the settlement is the most reasonable way to accommodate those potential customers who have expressed interest in obtaining natural gas service that would otherwise be unable to do so under existing tariffs and while protecting existing customers.
And your last statements are based, I assume, in part on your long experience with Chesapeake-related matters before this commission, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I've worked on Chesapeake matters for the past 6 years, since 2012.
And you believe the new rate classes and corresponding rates that are proposed as a result of the settlement meet the statutory requirement, is that correct?
Yes, I do.
Do you have anything else to add with regard to the settlement or to the testimonies that staff has filed and have been admitted in support of the settlement that you would like to bring before the commission or to other parties this afternoon?
No, I do not.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I have nothing further. The witness is available for cross-examination.
Any questions, Mr. Nutter?
No questioning, thank you.
Ms. Iori?
No questions.
Or questions from the commission?
Okay. Any commissioners have any questions of any of the parties? Really only 2.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So for Chesapeake,
Chair Winslow,
sorry.
Yes.
we have a witness.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said you had, you said you had no
I
questions.
said I had no questions,
I
but we do have a
apologize.
witness.
Yeah, I think we'd like to hear from the witness.
You haven't heard from me all day.
Thank you, Chair Winslow. The public advocate calls Drew Slater to the stand and asks that he be sworn.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Mr. Slater, would you please state your name for the record, please?
Andrew C. Slater,
And what is your business address?
29 South State Street, Dover, Delaware, 19901.
And by whom are you employed?
The Division of the Public Advocate.
And what is your position there?
I'm the public advocate.
Did you direct your counsel to file a statutory notice of intervention in this docket?
Yes.
And did the DPA retain Glenn Watkins of Technical Associates, Inc. to assist the Public Advocate's Office in this docket?
Yes.
Did Mr. Watkins prepare direct testimony on the Public Advocate's behalf?
Yes.
Did that testimony consist of 22 pages?
Yes.
And there were public and confidential versions of that testimony, correct?
That is correct.
Do you adopt Mr. Watkins's pre-filed testimony as your testimony today?
I do.
Do you have any changes or corrections to make to that testimony?
I do not.
If I asked you the questions contained in that testimony, would your answers be the same as contained in that testimony?
Yes.
Did the public advocate take issue with any of Chesapeake's proposals in its application?
Yes.
What did it take issue with?
Chesapeake proposed to apply the infrastructure expansion service rates that the commission approved in docket number 12292 for expansion projects in southeastern Sussex County to its entire service territory. We were concerned with the inputs to and assumptions made in Chesapeake's model for determining whether an expansion project would be economically feasible. Specifically, we had concerns about the assumptions relating to the participation, timing, and natural gas usage of new customers embedded into the company's model. And we were concerned that if those assumptions were overly optimistic, Chesapeake's current ratepayers would bear the risk that Chesapeake would not in fact earn its projected revenues from the expansion projects. The DPA made the following recommendations. The IES program shall not include acquisition of existing propane distribution systems. There should be an annual spending cap of $2.5 million, after which prior commission approval should be required. An $800 refundable deposit per customer for existing residential developments in neighborhoods to be converted. A developer builder advance of $3,700 per lot for new residential developments in neighborhoods. Imputing revenues of actual annual revenues are less than those used in the company's projected feasibility analysis. A 100-foot main extension allowance per customer with no additional charge. IES surcharge would be limited to 10 years from time service is initiated. IES surcharge should be redesigned from a fixed monthly charge to a volumetric usage structure, and the feasibility model should include only truly variable expenses.
Now, you entered into a settlement agreement on behalf of the public advocate in this case, right?
Yes.
And you have heard Mr. Everingham describe the terms of the proposed settlement, correct?
Yes.
Do you believe that the settlement results in just and reasonable rates and is in the public interest?
Yes.
Why do you believe that?
There's three primary reasons. Revenues can be imputed if actual annual revenues don't meet projected revenues. This protects existing ratepayers from subsidizing new customers. This aspect of the settlement was very important to me. If we believe the USA rates are reasonable for new customers that are added to the company's system, we believe. It was also important to me the new customers not have to pay these additional rates indefinitely. At some point, Chesapeake will reach the break-even point, after which it would be unfair for Chesapeake to continue to collect the USA rates from these customers. Chesapeake provided information from which we were able to negotiate a cutoff point that all parties could live with. We were also concerned that the A&G expenses that Chesapeake included in its project feasibility models, Chesapeake had provided notice of intent to file a rate case in September, and it will address the methodology regarding the A&G expenses in the projected feasibility models in that rate case. As with all settlements, we didn't get everything we wanted, but we got the things that we were most concerned with. We analyzed what we thought we would get in the contested proceeding and concluded that we were unlikely to achieve a significantly better result if we litigated this to a commission decision. So for these reasons, I believe the settlement results in just and reasonable rates and is in the public interest.
Thank you, Mr. Slater. Mr. Slater is available for cross-examination and questions from the commissioners.
No questions, Mr. Chair.
No questions.
Commissioners, any questions of any of the witnesses?
Yes, Mr. Chair, for Chesapeake. If any surplus revenues from these rates, where will they flow and whom will they benefit? So, for example, would they go as additional capital? Will they go to lower the rates of the customers in this area you're trying to build out? Will they be credits or reductions for all? Or will they go ROI, return on investment for the shareholders?
The revenues would be treated the same way that revenues from all projects throughout the company and the existing IES area are treated. If there were surplus revenues, the company came in for a base rate case, those revenues would be in the base rate case, and those would be looked at as a whole for the design of rates for the entire company's rate base.
So the upside on revenues from these projects would benefit all ratepayers as opposed to going back to the ratepayers who paid the special rate.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that would, or Mr. Commissioner, that could be correct.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Move we adopt order number 9246 as presented.
I second.
Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Special thanks to Mr. Smith for all of his fine work in leading this thing to a successful conclusion, and also thanks to the parties, and especially Ms. Iori and her witness. We have next public comment. Is there anyone here from the public that wishes to make public comment? I see one person raising her hand. Would you be, there's two or three.
Mr. Chairman, may I?
Are you here for the, for one of the items that's already on the agenda? Because if you are, we'll get that, to get to that. You won't be foreclosed. You'll be able to speak when that agenda item is on here.
Sure, this is to speak towards one of the director's items.
Yes, so he's saying you'll wait till I did the wine, thanks.
Yeah. So we'll do the director's comments next, which will include, I think, what the young lady was talking about.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I have here our very own Sam Hemphill to give you an update about all the legislative action that happened. And I want to, before even they start, I want to thank her and Matt Hardigan for the work they did, including staying up all night, I believe.
With all due respect, we have several people in the audience who have come perhaps a distance to be here. Are you going to address the EV situation first? So we can
switch
let,
it
so
around.
we can let them get out of here, because they've
Okay.
been sitting here through all these hearings, and I probably should have called this first and gotten them out of here, but why don't we do the EV thing first?
Sure. So,
First, if before we go ahead, everybody wants to talk about the electric vehicle issue, please come forward. While you're coming forward, we've received all kinds of communications from the Electrical Vehicle Charging Association, Tesla. Is there a Tesla out front for us to drive? And also, well, we received a lot of comments, and just to let you know, this commission does not want to regulate the charging stations that you are concerned about. We do not want to. We have pending legislation, and the legislature has a lot of different pressures on it, and it just so happened that this piece of legislation didn't make it out as we had hoped it would make it out in this last legislative session. And I don't think this commission wants to enforce a piece of legislation that we don't frankly have any belief in, and that everyone seems to believe should be changed. So what I'm going to propose for the commission is that we not do anything at all with respect to the enforcement of the present statute until June 30th of 2019. And we could put it off a lesser period of time, but then we would be expecting the legislature to sort of jump to on this one piece of legislation when their priorities might be elsewhere. So I think it was safest for us to put off any decision with respect to this issue till June 30th. And that's my personal thinking. I have not talked with any other commissioner about that.
Second thoughts.
Okay, so why don't you make a motion, and let's see if we can, if, any comments or any discussion by, go ahead, Joanne.
Move that we delay any action on the electric and gas vehicle charging stations until the end of the next legislative session on June 30th, 2019.
I second.
Is there any discussion on the motion as stated? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries. Do you all have anything to say?
I think that takes care of it.
Thank you, Chairman. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Patrick Bean from Tesla.
Could you spell your last name?
B-E-A-N. Really appreciate the comments and trying to find a resolution to this. We welcome future dialogue to try to come to a resolution. So don't want to go too far into it, but really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for your input. Mr. Slater.
Mr. Bean, real quick. So in the next legislative session, I'm hoping that the electric vehicle charging station and Tesla will support the legislation. And so we would look for that. And also the Sierra Club in Denmark, we would look for that support to try and push it through as quickly as possible.
Yes, and on that point, we didn't actually realize, we thought that the proposal was to bill customers on a kilowatt hour basis, and that's something that we're agnostic to. We think it's a good customer experience. Didn't realize that it was being driven by this, but now that we are aware of it, we will be more active in that.
Just for the record, Mr. Chairman, so the comments were about the Electric Vehicle Charging Association, Advanced Energy Economy, Tesla, and ChargePoint. There were 4 sets, and I go to, I'm sorry? There were,
I didn't get those. Are they?
I said there were 4 comments, so I was
Oh, yeah.
supporting that if these
Yes,
these
all of
groups,
the
yes, they
all
should
of the
come-
groups that
yeah,
submitted comments, as well as the Sierra Club and Denmark, I would
yeah,
look for their support.
they should
Thank you.
support this in the next session.
You've come all this way, so either one of the young ladies like to make a comment?
Stephanie Herron with the Sierra Club, and Herron, Herron, we did support Senate Bill 188, and we will look forward to working with you in the next legislative session to try to push this bill over the finish line. Unfortunately, it was on the agenda in the House and just didn't come up due to other political situations. But we appreciate the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brewer. Oh, I'm sorry, go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, I'm Kathleen Harris with the Denmark Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy. I just wanted to say thank you as well. We are here to encourage the commission to delay until the end of session, so we appreciate that delay. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you all for coming in. We appreciate it. Mr. Brewer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, Sam Hemphill will update you on the rest of the legislative agenda.
Good afternoon, Chairman and Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this update. PSC staff had a very successful year at Legislative Hall, passing 3 bills in total, HB 127, Senate Bill 189, and Senate Bill 191. HB 127 predates my time at the PSC, but we were able to get those last 2 in the final stretch of the 149th General Assembly. Senate Bill 189 relates to the Underground Utility and Safety Act, and we passed that in the early morning hours of July the 1st. And this bill is currently awaiting the governor's signature. Senate Bill 191, which relates to the elimination of Delmarva's IRP, saving Delmarva's ratepayers $500,000 every 2 years, also passed on July the 1st. And barring any unforeseen circumstances, which can happen, the governor will sign this into law tomorrow. Unfortunately, 2 of our legislative initiatives, which we've talked about, one of them today, did not make it through the 149th. But I want to make clear that these bills did not fail. They simply died. The legislature, I'm going to be very diplomatic, the legislature just ran out of time. So Senate Bill 188, which is relating to electric vehicle and natural vehicle charging stations, and Senate Bill 226, which was a statute cleanup bill, did not make it through. However, they will be my first priority in January of 2019. Thank you.
Mr. Slater?
Oh, because you haven't heard from me enough already today, perhaps for the next several months. Actually just want to commend Sam and Matt for all, and Raj for all their work on this. You don't see all the behind-the-scenes stuff on a day-to-day basis, but the pleading, prodding, begging to get any bills done, I can't let that go without commending the PSC staff, because these bills were very important. As Sam said, there's others to come, but you don't see all the begging that takes place and bartering behind scenes, and so I just want to commend them.
And I would like to add, on behalf of the commission, that we greatly appreciate the work of Mr. Hardigan and Ms. Hemphill, because I know from past experience that it's very difficult to get legislation through, and they've been very successful this year. So we're grateful and thankful. And now the problem is, for both of you, is that you've raised our expectations. So we hope that the other legislation gets passed.
Well, Mr. Chair, I'd like to supplement that Sam was at a conference, and I saw her going down the hall, and I was being cordial to wave. She had a phone on both ears, and she was carrying briefcase, and she said, "Leg haul," and she kept going. So, thanks a lot. Job well done.
Raj.
Yes, sir. So the evidentiary hearing for the Delaware light plug-in vehicle charging case has been postponed. That's the hearing examiner will send you a report. As mentioned, the IRP bill will be in law soon, and so the Delmarva IRP meeting is canceled. NARUC summer meeting is next week in Scottsdale, Arizona. In attendance are Chairman Winslow, Commissioner Gray, Sam Hemphill, and Jason Smith of staff. There's 4 attendants. July 24th, 2018 is our next commission meeting. And last but not least, it gives me great pleasure to introduce everybody to the new president of the Mid-Atlantic Conference of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. You can see the pictures. Our very own Chairman Dallas Winslow. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Raj. That is it. Thank you all very much. We're adjourned.